The story of a man named Walter White. Senior Division, Group Documentary, Spencer Valenti and Sergio Alonso. March 3rd, 2017.
I am not white. There is nothing within my mind and heart which tempts me to think I am. These are words from the civil rights activist Walter White. In 1931, African Americans throughout the United States were facing racial discrimination and segregation when Walter Francis White became the executive of the NAACP. For the next 24 years, White fought for African Americans' equality. As a result, White, politically, blocked a racist man from a major role in the government, socially got President FDR to issue an executive order from a March on Washington movement, and economically created a legal defense and educational fund for African Americans and their justice.
Walter White was born in Atlanta, Georgia, on July 1st, 1893. From that day, his life revolved around equality. White stood up and fought for African Americans' rights because they faced inequality and discrimination throughout the United States. Blacks were segregated, and White wanted to change that, just like other civil rights activists. Although Walter was white, he never counted himself to be because he accepted his African American heritage proudly and chose to identify himself as an African American. When White was 13 years old, he determined that he could never be part of a race that had much hatred. And he said that because in 1906, a white mob threatened him and his family. That still didn't stop him from fighting for blacks' equality. In 1918, he became a part of the NAACP as a lynching investigator and expert. His great accomplishments as an investigator made him become the executive leader in 1931. When he started, he focused on two things: equality for all and stopping lynching. In 1922, the Dyer Bill was passed, which influenced the text of anti-lynching, and he finally convinced Americans to abandon it. His work was acknowledged in 1937 when the NAACP awarded him its highest honor, the Spring Garden Medal. He also helped stop John J. Parker from the Supreme Court because Parker was a supporter of disenfranchising African Americans. He also supported A. Philip Randolph in the March on Washington, and he got President FDR to pass the executive order. The executive order was to prohibit racial discrimination in the national defense industry and promote equal opportunity in the United States. Throughout well into the 1940s, White spent increasing amounts of time in Washington, D.C., on a mission to force members of Congress and the Senate to address racial issues. White then tackled the issue of racial discrimination in the armed forces. Since blacks were only cooks, food service, and freight handlers, his actions made President Harry S. Truman finally issue an executive order officially banning segregation in the armed forces in 1948. Later on, he managed to make the Legal Defense and Educational Fund pass, which ended segregation in schools throughout the United States in 1954.
Mr. White's stand in history will go down as one of the most influential and impactful events of all time. His leadership in the NAACP helped him earn the nickname that we now know as Mr. NAACP. White's political impact was when he blockaded John J. Parker from going to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. Parker, who was a white man, supported the disenfranchising of African Americans. Mr. Parker was a native of North Carolina, and back then it was a racist state. He was a racist man who wanted no part with blacks and wanted them all to be killed. When Parker tried to run back for the Supreme Court the second time, it was a very close vote. White was the one who determined that he would not be elected. Another key moment was when Walter took a social stand when he took a prominent role in Asa Philip Randolph's March on Washington. The main focus was racism in employment, and they both addressed this situation very seriously. The outcome of this situation was the executive order of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt 8802, Fair Employment Practice in Defense Industries. White also had an economical standpoint when he helped establish the Legal Defense and Educational Fund for African Americans. African Americans were experiencing justice issues, limited education, and there was almost no scholarships for them either. This legal defense and educational fund helped provide Social Security, more education, and more scholarships.
Short-term and long-term impacts changed the world and made the United States better. His short-term was that he made the Supreme Court fair. By stopping John J. Parker, he did this because Parker was all about not supporting blacks, and he wished for the worst for them and wanted white superiority. Parker came very close, but lost to a 41-39 vote. The NAACP investigated him and stopped him, and at the time, Walter White was the executive leader. Parker was a federal judge from North Carolina, and in their investigation of him, they found that he had supported the disenfranchisement of African Americans in his 1920 campaign for governor. The association decided to oppose his nomination, and Walter White testified against him before the Senate Judiciary Committee. His testimony did little to stop the nomination, which was also opposed by the American Federation of Labor because Parker's support of so-called yellow dog contracts, which forbid worker participation in unions. Rather than lobbying senators, their usual practice, White urged their branches and members to telegraph their senators and threaten to oppose them in the elections that were to take place later that year. When the Senate narrowly defeated Parker's nomination, White said that the NAACP's opposition had been the deciding factor and lavished praise on the branches that had threatened their senators with their oppositions to any who supported Parker. White's long-term impact was the March on Washington. African Americans face discrimination and unfair treatment all around the world, and so White decided to support A. Philip Randolph on the march. They marched for the equal treatment they wanted and for other demands. A. Philip Randolph later began to plan other marches with other black leaders in 1960 and 1963. The marches were unsurprisingly successful and represented an affirmation of hope, of belief in the democratic process, and of faith in the capacity of blacks and whites to work together for racial equality. Over 200,000 black and white Americans had a joyous day of speeches, songs, and prayers, led by a celebrated array of clergymen, civil rights leaders, politicians, and entertainers. The marches all began with A. Philip Randolph planning a march on Washington first in 1941, and White getting President FDR to sign the executive order, and him supporting the marches.
White is known to be a major figure in African American politics. His presence was felt after his death in 1955 due to a heart attack. His impacts resulted in blocking a very popular political figure from going into a major role in the U.S. government because he was a racist, making President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issue an executive order that abolished segregation and racial discrimination in employment businesses. And lastly, he helped establish a legal defense and educational fund that increased educational opportunities as well as equality for African Americans. His stand in history has a long-lasting impact on today as well as the future. He has paved the way for African Americans to be accepted as who they are and what they choose to do and how they do it.